Welcome back, everyone. So we ended the last class by looking at the similarities between the Gessellian and Keynesian views of interest. While there are important differences, something they agreed on was that they both viewed interest as arising from money's superiority to other assets as a store of value, which means that savers need to be compensated to temporarily renounce the advantages of money and hold their wealth in other forms, thereby returning money to circulation. Another more blunt way of saying the same thing is that they both essentially viewed interest as a ransom that producers and consumers of goods and services must pay to holders of money in order to reap the advantages of the division of labor. Today, we're going to get more specific and look at some concrete examples of how interest negatively impacts our lives, even if we never borrow or lend money. And then in the next class, we'll finally get to Gesell's proposed solution to the problem. At the end of the last class, I read a quote from Keynes in which he said that the interest rate on money plays a peculiar role in limiting the level of employment, since it sets a standard which the marginal efficiency of capital must reach if it is to be newly produced. This is an extremely important concept and one that we need to examine in greater detail in order to understand why Silvio Gesell considers interest a root cause of poverty, unemployment, and recurring economic crises. So what does Keynes mean when he says that interest sets a standard which the marginal efficiency of capital must reach if it is to be newly produced? Well, first we need to define the marginal efficiency of capital. This refers to the expected return that will be generated by investing in the creation of the next piece of new capital. In other words, with a given quantity of existing capital, how much money can an entrepreneur expect to make by investing in the creation of a new piece of capital, whether that means buying a new piece of equipment, building a new factory, increasing inventory, etc. It should be pointed out that the marginal efficiency of capital is not an objectively measurable quantity because it's a prediction about the future. It's an estimate of how much future revenue will be generated as a result of an investment in new capital today. So that is by its nature uncertain. At any point in time, there's a universe of potential entrepreneurs who would like to engage in productive enterprise or expand existing enterprises. Whether or not they're able to do so depends on their ability to attract funding. So we can think of the range of different prospective enterprises as a menu from which savers can choose where to deploy their money. A company that wants to dig for gold in South America is an item on the menu, as is a biomedical research company that wants to develop a new drug, and a housewife who wants to turn her passion for baking cookies into a business. They all need capital, and their ability to attract funding determines whether or not their prospective ideas will become actual businesses. So they all do the best they can to tell a compelling story and explain why savers should provide them with funding. And the universe of savers evaluates those stories and predicts how much return the prospective businesses will generate. Those predictions constitute the schedule of the marginal efficiency of capital. To avoid getting bogged down in complexity, we're going to make a simplifying assumption. We're going to assume away the element of uncertainty. Obviously, in the real world, investing in a biomedical startup has very different risk characteristics from investing in a cookie business. So we can't directly compare their projected rates of return. But we're going to ignore that for the moment and just assume that every prospective business has a projected rate of return that is certain. Of course, that's not a realistic assumption, but including the element of risk in this analysis would complicate the picture, but wouldn't change the overall point. So let's say that on the menu of prospective enterprises, there are some with projected returns of 12%, others projecting 10%, some with 8%, some with 6%, some with 3%, and some with 0%. Since we've assumed away the element of uncertainty, the marginal saver will simply choose the investment that offers the highest rate of return currently available. So let's say that on the menu, the enterprise which offered 12% has already been fully funded, and so has the one offering 10%. So those menu items are no longer available. The next highest return, which is currently available, is 8%. And of course, there are still the menu items with 6%, 3%, and 0%. Clearly, the marginal saver is going to choose the item offering 8%. So 8% is the current marginal efficiency of capital. Let's also say that the prevailing rate of interest, the rate that an entrepreneur has to pay to borrow money, is 5%. This means there are profitable investment opportunities available. Borrowing money at 5% and investing it in something that will generate a return of 8% is a profitable investment. So a marginal efficiency of capital in excess of the rate of interest means that prospective enterprises will receive funding and new capital will be created. And new investments will continue to be made until the marginal efficiency of capital falls to match the rate of interest, at which point the creation of capital will stop. So the rate of interest becomes a threshold that new capital investments must exceed in order to receive funding. Therefore, with a given marginal efficiency of capital schedule, the rate of interest will determine how much total capital will exist. All capital investments projected to return more than 5% will receive funding. Those expected to return 5% or less will not receive funding. And that cutoff point will determine how much capital exists across the entire economy. But now let's recall the hypothetical saving investment scenario in a non-monetary economy that I described in the last class. We imagined that there was a cattle rancher who produced more beef than he needed to exchange in order to obtain all of the goods and services that he and his family consume. Therefore, he had savings. But the problem he faced was that his savings were in a form that would rapidly deteriorate and lose all their value. So what was the solution to the problem? By finding another member of the community who could productively employ the rancher's excess beef, he could preserve the value of his savings. Now let's ask ourselves, does the rancher need to be offered a positive return in order to choose to make this investment? Would he say, no, this investment only offers me a 4% rate of return, I'm not going to make it? Obviously not, if his alternative is to hold on to his deteriorating beef. So what this thought experiment reveals is that the notion of savers demanding a minimum rate of return below which they will not provide their savings to entrepreneurs is not necessarily a feature of a natural economy, that is, an economy composed only of goods and services. Since we've already established that most real wealth loses value with the passage of time, simply preserving one's wealth is a great outcome, if the alternative is holding on to depreciating assets. That was the point of the Robinson Crusoe parable. So the fact that savers won't fund the creation of new capital below a certain threshold is due to the fact that they have a more attractive alternative. And why do they have that alternative? Because of the existence of interest, which both Gesell and Keynes attribute to the hoardability of money. So the thing that stops the process of capital formation is money. If savers didn't have the option of lending their money and receiving interest, they would have an incentive to fund the menu items projecting returns of 4%, 3%, 2%. In fact, if the only alternative was to hold depreciating assets, they would have incentives to fund new capital with a projected return of 0%, and maybe even those with negative returns, provided that the negative returns are less than the rate of depreciation of tangible wealth. This means that according to both Gesell and Keynes, the limiting factor to the creation of new capital has nothing to do with the natural levels of supply and demand for tangible assets, but is rather a consequence of the hoardability of money. An obvious conclusion is that if money didn't have this advantage over tangible wealth, and therefore didn't enable holders of money to exact interest, the capital formation process would continue beyond the current limit set by money. And this is the dynamic that I was talking about in the Q&A part of a previous class when I said that interest-bearing money causes capital to always be scarce. Money puts a limit on the creation of capital, causing its supply to always be less than the level at which the supply and demand of real assets would naturally find equilibrium. And this scarcity caused by money is the reason why capital is able to generate excess returns. It's a power that is not inherent in the nature of physical capital, but is transferred to physical capital from money. And as I've said before, this is exactly opposite to both the classical and Marxist views, which believe that interest originates in physical capital and from there is transferred to money. Here's how Gesell describes this transference. Money lays down the condition for the construction of a house or factory or ship that the house must be able to extract from its tenants, or the factory from its workmen, or the ship from its freight, the same interest that money itself can at any time extract from wares. No interest means no money for houses, factories, or ships. And without money, how could anyone collect and put together the 1,000 different articles necessary for the construction of a ship, a factory, a house? Without money, it's inconceivable that a house or ship or factory could ever be constructed. So the foundation capital of every capitalistic undertaking consists of a sum of money. For the millions of factories, ships, rented houses, it may be said, in the beginning, there was money. But if no money is given for the construction of houses unless they can exact the same interest that money itself exacts from wares, building is suspended, and the consequent scarcity of houses raises rent, just as the scarcity of factories lowers wages. Houses, ships, and factories, in short, all so-called real capital, must therefore necessarily yield interest equal to the tribute which money can impose as basic interest upon the exchange of wares. Houses, factories, machinery are capital. They do not, like wares, collect interest as bank messengers in order to hand it over to the possessors of money. They collect it for the owner of the house or factory. This power does not, however, lie in the characteristics of such things, but in the fact that money here, precisely as with wares, prepares the market conditions necessary for the collection of interest. The ratio of houses to tenants, of ships to freights, of workmen to factories is regularly, artificially, and inevitably so constituted by the present form of money that demand, tenants and workers, is always faced with an insufficient supply. The traditional form of money provided by the state protects all existing houses from the interest-reducing competition of new houses. It is given only for the construction of as many houses as can be built without causing the yield to fall below basic interest. This fact is confirmed by thousands of years of experience. So-called real capital is therefore anything rather than real. Money alone is true capital, basic capital. All other capital objects are completely dependent upon the characteristics of the existing form of money. They are its creatures. They receive the title of nobility, the title of capital, from money. Deprive money of the privilege of forbidding the workers to build new houses, tear down the barrier raised by money between the workers and real capital, and the supply of such things will increase until they lose the characteristics of capital. So let's think about the mechanics whereby the interest-generating power of money is transferred to real capital. To understand how this works, let's ask ourselves two questions. What effect does the artificial limit on capital formation have on wages? And what effect does it have on the prices of goods and services? Obviously, the more capital there is, the more labor you need to employ that capital. So this means that an artificial scarcity of capital causes there to be less demand for labor than there would be if the capital creation process continued beyond the limit at which the rate of interest causes it to stop. Therefore, artificially scarce capital means artificially low wages. And what about the prices of goods and services? Well, obviously, more capital means more competition among producers, and therefore higher quality and lower priced goods and services. So just as the artificial scarcity of capital leads to artificially low wages, it also leads to artificially high prices of goods and services. So workers get the short end of the stick, both as producers and consumers. The impact of interest on the production of capital means that they earn less in wages and they pay more for the goods and services than would be the case if the capital formation process continued beyond the limit set by the rate of interest. And the situation of the owners of capital is the mirror image of that of the workers. The fact that employers pay less for labor and receive higher prices for their goods and services means that they make higher profits. So with that in mind, let's read the opening paragraph of the Natural Economic Order for the third time. The abolition of unearned income, of so-called surplus value, also termed interest and rent, is the immediate economic aim of every socialistic movement. The method generally proposed for the attainment of this aim is communism in the shape of nationalization or socialization of production. I know of only one socialist, Pierre-Joseph Prudhon, whose investigations into the nature of capital point to the possibility of another solution of the problem. The demand for nationalization of production is advocated on the plea that the nature of the means of production necessitates it. It is usually asserted offhand as a truism that ownership of the means of production must necessarily in all circumstances give the capitalist the upper hand when bargaining with the workers about wages, an advantage represented and destined eternally to be represented by surplus value or capital interest. No one except Prudhon was able to conceive that the preponderance now manifestly on the side of property can be shifted to the side of the dispossessed, the workers, simply by the construction of a new house beside every existing house, of a new factory beside every factory already established. So are you now gaining a deeper understanding of what Gesell was talking about here? Imagine how different the world would be if the owners of trillions of dollars, which are currently being unproductively hoarded in cash, checking accounts, or short-term risk-free lending, were no longer offered those artificial safe havens in which to store wealth, and had to instead choose between seeing their wealth lose value with the passage of time or investing it in productive capital. Imagine how much more capital there would be. Imagine how much more demand for labor there would be. Imagine how much higher wages would be. Imagine how much cheaper goods and services would be. That is what Gesell is referring to when he says that Prudhon pointed us toward a different solution, whereby the preponderance now manifestly on the side of property can be shifted to the side of the workers. Just to reinforce the point, let's think about how the same dynamic applies to the housing market. Generally speaking, the decision of whether or not to build additional houses is based on the same kinds of calculations that determine whether or not to invest in new businesses. If the projected returns are higher than the rate of interest, funding will be available for building new houses. But as the supply of houses increases, that pushes down rents and therefore the return on investment for owners of houses until it no longer exceeds the rate of interest, at which point the construction of new houses stops. And just like with the analysis of the creation of productive capital, the point at which the building of new houses stops is not a function of supply and demand in the real economy of goods and services, but is rather an artificial limit caused by the existence of interest. This means that the market never produces enough houses, and housing costs are therefore artificially elevated. This shifts wealth from renters to homeowners. In Marxist terminology, this is another example of surplus value. So what would happen if the rate of interest fell to zero? Well, more houses would be built, rents would fall, and wealth would be shifted from the owners of houses to renters. And at the same time, there would be more demand for labor in housing-related industries. So once again, workers lose both as producers and consumers. The effect of the artificial limit to the construction of houses is that wages are artificially suppressed and the cost of housing is artificially elevated. One more thing to think about is that housing represents the largest single expense of many households, and it also represents the largest single investment of many other households. In other words, the effect of the distortion of supply and demand for houses caused by interest is to effectively drive a wedge through the wealth distribution graph of society as a whole. Those to the left of the wedge, that is, those on the lower end of the wealth spectrum, who tend to be renters, are pushed further to the left because the cost of housing prevents them from being able to save, while those to the right of the wedge, on the upper end of the wealth distribution, who are generally homeowners, are pushed further to the right as their wealth increases due to the artificially elevated values of their homes. So once again, this sheds more light on what Gesell was talking about when he said, the solution to economic injustice is the construction of a new house beside every existing house, of a new factory beside every factory already established. So do you now see how Gesell's proposed solution has the exact same starting point, which led Marx to call for the abolition of private ownership of the means of production? They both agree that the problem is what Marx calls surplus value and Gesell calls capital interest. But they attribute the existence of surplus value to different causes. Therefore, it makes sense that they came to different conclusions about how to solve the problem. Since we already established that Marx essentially ignored the subject of money, obviously he had to look elsewhere for the cause of surplus value. According to Gesell, that's where Marx went wrong. So their different explanations for the causes of surplus value led Marx to conclude that the solution is to eliminate the free market system, while Gesell's analysis of the causes of surplus value led him to conclude that the solution is to perfect the free market system. And does this also shed more light on the title of this course, Beyond Capitalism versus Socialism? Now would be a good time to give Gesell's definition of capitalism. I made the argument in a previous class that capitalism and the free market system are not the same thing. So what is capitalism? Here's Gesell's definition. Capitalism is an economic condition in which the demand for loan money and real capital exceeds the supply and therefore gives rise to interest. So capitalism is not a system at all. The free market system is a system. Capitalism is a condition. It's a pathological condition in which the natural processes of the free market system have been distorted and short-circuited by our irrational systems of money and land. And that condition can be cured by fixing those two problems. Here's how Gesell describes the end of capitalism. Guided by this corrected theory of capital, we shall learn that the removal of certain artificial obstacles due to private ownership of land and our irrational monetary system will enable our present economic order to fully realize its fundamentally sound principle. The removal of these obstacles will allow the workers by their own labor, and in a short time, 10 to 20 years, to so alter the market conditions for capital that surplus value will disappear completely and the means of production will lose their capitalistic character. I want to repeat that last phrase. The means of production will lose their capitalistic character. Private ownership of the means of production will then present no advantage beyond that which the owner of a savings box derives from its possession. The savings box does not yield him surplus value or interest, but he can gradually use up its contents. The savings or other money then invested in the means of production, house, ship, factory, will be returned to the owners in the shape of the sums annually written off their value in proportion to their natural wear and tear or consumption. Simply by means of untrammeled hard work, fructified by the powerful modern instruments of production, the great, admired, and dreaded tyrant capital will be reduced to the harmless role of a child's porcelain savings box. The savings box yields no surplus value, and to get at its contents, its owner must break it. So the idea that the free market system and socialism are opposed to one another is partly due to the conflation of the free market system and capitalism. Once we disentangle those two things, Gesell tells us that the free market system and the goals of socialism are consistent and compatible. The way to eliminate surplus value and enable workers to receive the full proceeds of their labor is to fix the two flaws in our current implementation of the free market system, our systems of land and money. The result will be an end of the diseased condition known as capitalism and a realization of the full potential of the free market system, in which the promise of a rising tide that lifts all boats becomes a reality. Before moving on, I want to briefly insert some of my own personal views on economic policy that I think relate to the problematic framing of economic policy debates as capitalist versus socialist, left versus right, or progressive versus conservative. I've often said that my heart is with the left, but my head cannot get on board with their policies. For example, it's basic progressive orthodoxy these days that we should push for an increase in the minimum wage. But with this specific issue, as with many progressive economic policy priorities, I question the wisdom not because I disagree with the goal of increasing wages, but because I doubt whether the policy will achieve that goal. Today's left generally views its role as reining in the free market system and using government to change economic outcomes. This is such a widely held perspective that if one even questions its wisdom, one is likely to be attacked as an apologist for capitalism. But from a Gesellian perspective, the way to improve the economic circumstances of the working class is not to use government as a tool to impede the operation of the free market. Rather, he says the best way to accomplish that goal is to remove the artificial obstacles to the proper functioning of free market processes. And if that's really the best approach, most of the specific policy priorities of today's left are unlikely to achieve their goals and may in fact be counterproductive. Gesell makes this point by contrasting Marx and Prudhon. In the introduction to his book, Gesell discussed complaints by German landlords in his day that they were experiencing hardship due to excessive construction of houses, a phenomenon Gesell referred to as the building plague. Let's listen to how Gesell describes the different perspectives of Marx and Prudhon on the phenomenon of the building plague. Gesell writes, "Capital, which Marxists hold in such awe, dies of the building plague. It decamps before the building fury of the workers. What would Prudhon and Marx have advised in such a situation? Stop building, Marx would have cried. Lament, go a-begging, bemoan your unemployment, declare a strike. For every house you build adds to the power of the capitalists as sure as 2 and 2 make 4. The power of capital is measured by surplus value, in this case, house rent. So the greater the number of houses, the more powerful surely is capital. Therefore, let me advise you, limit your output, agitate for an 8-hour or even a 6-hour day, since every house you build adds to house rent, and house rent is surplus value. Restrain, therefore, your building fury, for the less you build, the more cheaply you'll be housed." Probably Marx would have shrunk from uttering such nonsense, but the Marxian doctrine, which regards capital as a material commodity, misleads the workers into thinking and acting on these lines. Now, listen to Prudhon. "Full steam ahead. Let's have the building fury. Give us the building plague. Workers, on no account let the trowel be snatched from your hands. Down with all who attempt to interfere with your work. They are your deadly enemies. Who are these that prate of a building plague, of overproduction in the housing industry, while house rents still show a trace of surplus value, of capital interest? Let capital die of the building plague. For some 5 years only have you been allowed to indulge in your building fury, and already capitalists feel the pinch. Already they are lamenting the decline of surplus value. Rents have already dropped from 4% to 3%, that is, by a quarter. 3 times 5 years more of untrammeled labor, and you will be reveling in houses freed from surplus value. Capital is dying, and it is you who are killing it by your labor. This casts the economic program of today's left in a different light, doesn't it? And this is why I couldn't find my way out of the intellectual box that I found myself in my 20s. Obviously, the capitalistic status quo isn't acceptable, but the only alternative I was aware of didn't make sense to me. Only when I became acquainted with Gesell did I see a way out of this dilemma. And as I said on the first day of this course, the way out cannot be found by choosing between capitalism or socialism. Okay, in the beginning of this course, I said that Gesell's analysis of money helps explain poverty, wealth inequality, recurring economic crises, and our unsustainable pursuit of growth. So we just talked about the first two of those items, the ways in which the monetary rate of interest distorts the natural processes of wealth creation and distribution so as to enrich the owners of capital at the expense of workers. This is how interest causes poverty and wealth inequality. Next, I want to look at how our form of money causes economic instability and recurring crises. As I said repeatedly during the Q&A portions of these classes, conventional monetary policy tends to focus on the quantity of money rather than its velocity of circulation, whereas Gesell's analysis and proposals focus on the issue of velocity. Keynes famously referred to animal spirits when diagnosing the causes of economic instability and crises. What he meant by this was the unstable and unpredictable element of human psychology and how it impacts the economy. Economic sentiment can turn on a dime. People can go from optimism to pessimism and vice versa pretty much instantaneously. This obviously can be a contributor to economic instability and can make the job of policymakers very difficult, since they're often in a position of trying to counteract volatile swings in sentiment. Witness how quickly we can go from talk of the Fed having to urgently loosen monetary policy in order to avert deflation to all of a sudden having to tighten in order to control inflation. And let's remind ourselves of something we discussed in the last class. When describing the different natures of supply in the form of unhoardable goods and services and demand in the form of hoardable money, Gesell said that supply is independent of the will of producers of goods and services due to the compulsion to circulate, which is inherent in the physical nature of wares. In contrast to this, demand is discretionary due to the fact that money can be withheld from circulation without imposing costs or losses on its owners. According to Gesell, it's the optional nature of demand that is the main cause of what Keynes referred to as animal spirits. In his view, hoardable money causes a herd instinct to operate in exactly the wrong directions at exactly the wrong times. We already discussed how the incentives facing holders of money when prices are falling cause them to postpone their purchases precisely at the times when society most needs them to spend, and how this is a cause of the self-reinforcing nature of deflation. But the mirror image also happens on the other side of the coin, that is, under inflationary conditions. Thus far, we've mainly focused on how the fact that money was designed to perform the store of value function prevents it from performing the medium of exchange function, but it actually works the other way around as well. Remember Gesell's statement that the power of money to affect exchanges, its technical quality from the mercantile standpoint, is in inverse proportion to its technical quality from the banking standpoint. Under inflationary conditions, money performs the medium of exchange function much more effectively, which means that it performs the store of value function less effectively. Just as how money is a great way to hold wealth when prices are falling, since its purchasing power increases, the opposite is the case when prices rise. Money loses purchasing power when prices rise, Therefore, holders of money are incentivized to convert their money into other forms in order to preserve their wealth. And often, just like with deflation, inflation can be a self-reinforcing process. Prices rise, causing people with stores of money to want to get rid of their money. That is, to convert it into other forms by buying other assets, which causes prices to rise even more. So the hoardability of money, which makes demand discretionary, causes money to zig when society needs it to zag, and to zag when society needs it to zig. Our form of money incentivizes the exact opposite behavior from what society needs holders of money to do in order to maintain economic stability. Thus, animal spirits drive economic sentiment to swing from one extreme to the other, causing what we erroneously refer to as the business cycle. We should describe it more accurately as the money cycle. And as we'll see in the next class, one of the primary goals of Gesell's proposal for a different kind of money is to remove the discretionary element of demand. According to Gesell's view, since the physical laws of the universe dictate that supply of goods and services is independent of the will of their producers, in order to achieve balance and stability, demand, in the shape of money, also needs to be independent of the will of its holders. One more important way in which interest negatively affects the real economy is the way in which it drives our unsustainable pursuit of growth. In order to talk about this point, I'd like to introduce a special guest. Felix Fuders is a professor of economics at the Universidad Austral de Chile, and also the president of the INWO, the Foundation for a Natural Economic Order, which is the main Gesellian organization in Germany. He's written extensively on Gesell in German, English, and Spanish, including his most recent book, which I mentioned previously, entitled How to Fulfill the UN Sustainability Goals, Rethinking the Role and Concept of Money in the Light of Sustainability, in which he argues that it's impossible to rein in our unsustainable pursuit of growth without reforming our monetary system along the lines proposed by Silvio Gesell. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Felix for a few minutes and let him introduce himself and talk a bit about the connection between our existing form of money and the so-called growth imperative.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for the introduction. I've prepared some slides. I'm going to talk about the growth imperative inherent in our financial system and the problems that arise hereof. And also we will see how financial crisis, as you already mentioned, inequality and even inflation and unemployment have to do with the unnatural design of our money. To understand this, we need to understand that money is the blood of our economy. Blood is a means of transportation. It transports nutrients and oxygens to the cells, and if the blood circulation gets stuck, the body gets ill. And the same is true with our economy. If the circulation of money gets stuck, so the economy will choke. The point is that the idea of money is to facilitate the exchange of goods and service. This is the first and primarily sense of money. It has to circulate the economy to be able to fulfill this function. But there's another function usually attributed to money. This is money at the store of value. Well, and those two functions contradict themselves. It's obvious that money cannot circulate in the economy at the same time and at the same time be stored under the mattress. And in fact, because of this contradiction, all those problems just mentioned arise. Why do we not hoard, at least not major parts of our money, under the mattress? This is because we receive a reward, we receive interest. Interest is, as Keynes called it, a reward for parting with liquidity. To come back to the metaphor of money as the blood of our economy, interest would be the drug that maintains money circulating. So money comes with a kind of genetic flaw. It gets it's always been a little bit sticky and does not really circulate as it should. And so we need this drug, the drug interest. And as with any drug that is taken for a long time, it has major side effects. And we can understand this taking into account that interest makes deposits grow. And they don't even grow only linear, but even exponentially. Because any bank account after some period of time will have doubled. And always if something doubles after a certain time, this is an exponential function. So $100 will be 200, then after all next 15 years, 400, then 800, and so on. So we have a function that grows slowly at the beginning, but then ever faster. And even if the interest rate is really low, so the flat part of the curve would be longer, but then also with low interest rates, we'll get to the steep part fast. So this is a very unnatural growth, and it's difficult for us to understand it because nothing in nature grows exponentially forever. But this is here a good example to understand exponential growth is this example. Imagine a person like, for example, Jesus would have inherited 1 cent, just 1 cent from his father Joseph. And if he would have put this 1 cent in a bank account with 5% annual interest rate, how much would be the value on the bank account be today? The answer is that would be 400 billion planets Earth of fine gold. We can already imagine that this has to cause some crisis after some time. And since there's no interest paying without debt, the total debt of the economy has to grow in the likewise manner. So we have deposits grow and total debt of the economy grow. And interestingly, each dollar bill states this on each dollar bill we can read this. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. It seems like it's not for buying like cars or meat or milk. It's to settle a debt. In German, there is a saying which represents this too very good. Die Wertpapiere des einen sind die Schulden des anderen. The financial assets of the one person are the debts of the other one. So if money supply and all deposits taken together is the money supply, if money supply grows exponentially, and here we see the money supply of the US, so the total debt has to grow in the likewise manner. And in fact, it does. Here we see the graph of the US total debt next to the US money supply. Well, we see they grow exponentially and they grow exactly in the same way. To put it in the words of Nobel Prize winner Felix Fuders, money is a credit-debt relation from which none can effectually escape. And now we can understand where the crisis comes from. Well, if debts grow and grow, it will come a point in the economy that people will not be able to pay the debts or the interest burden that go along with that. Banks will start and granting loans to people with a subprime solvency, not because they're so greedy, but because they have to grant ever more loans because deposits also grow. And we can now understand also where inflation comes from. Well, if money supply grows faster than GDP, and this will happen after some point, so we will see inflation and also price bubbles. Price bubbles on real estates, for example, or stocks, gold or Bitcoin are nothing else than a partial inflation on investment markets. So I said we will talk about, we also understand where the obligation to grow come from. We see this in politics, left side politics, right side politics, everywhere in the world. The solution is the economy has to grow. But why is this? Well, this has also to do with the fact that money makes deposits, the money in deposits grows and also debt grows. So if a business has an ever more debt burden, ever-growing debt burden, and if the owner of the business does not want to lose status quo, so what will he try to do? He will try to sell more. And even if he's lucky and does not have any debt, so he still has to grow. Why? Because his employees want a readjustment for inflation, which we just have seen has also to do with an ever-growing money supply. And even if he's lucky and his employees do not want any readjustment for inflation, he still has to grow for a third reason. And this is, in my opinion, the most important reason. Imagine you have a business and the money invested in your business does not yield a return which you would gain in the bank account. Would you keep on with your business? Probably not, right? You will shut it down. So interest is the opportunity cost of any productive investment. It is the benchmark. And if we do not earn at least what the bank would pay us for the same investment, doesn't make sense. So the interest rate sets the rhythm after which the economy has to dance. And it's not just a fetish, as some people believe. And we can now understand also where unemployment comes from. We now, from Arthur Okun, we have to grow like 3% to cut down unemployment 0.5%. This is known. We know this empirically, but we don't really understand why is this. But now we can understand it. Of course, if businesses cannot or do not manage to grow, well, what would be the second best alternative if they do not want to lose status quo? Well, they will cut costs. And how do we cut costs in the most effective way? Replacing human capital by machines. And this is why we see this dichotomy. We either grow, or we see unemployment. And if the machine gets old, then it will also look for a new job. And we can understand also where the unemployment, where the other big problem comes from, the inequality, which is a problem everywhere in the world today. In the same time, or at least as much as in the time of Karl Marx. If we imagine, or if we see the deposits grow exponentially and debt grows in the likewise manner, and we put it in the same graph, so we have this debt mirroring the deposits, and the gap, this is the inequality. This is the wealth gap. And to use, we'll see a graph with real data from the US, we can clearly see how money supply and debt grow in a likewise manner and how the gap grows. And it is not just that inequality grows exponentially, it is an unjust inequality. Why is it unjust? Because as already Aristotle pointed out, money does not work, nor does it have offspring. So if someone earns interest, then this is not because of his own work, but of the work someone else has performed, usually the person who gets indebted and invests it productively. And in most cases, even at the risk of the person who gets indebted, not the risk of the person who gives the loan. Unfortunately, we don't really understand this in economics because we use money and capital as synonyms. So as if money was a production factor. But money does not work, nor does it have offspring. And you can really try it by yourself, put some bills together with red light or whatever, will not nothing will happen. They will not have offspring. So it's people who have to work, and if someone earns interest, it's because someone else had to earn it. The problem is, if we keep on growing, we will destroy the environment. Exponential growth is not possible on a finite planet, which already also Aristotle had pointed out. Anyone who believes, this is my favorite quote here, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go forever on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. As Kenneth Boulding had pointed out in 1973 in the US Congress. So first and second law of thermodynamics tell us we cannot produce something out of nothing, and everything we produce will end up as waste. So really, we shouldn't really wonder why we are destroying our environment. We can maybe produce things more efficiently, someone would say now. We can do this pan with less material, with less input. Yes, we can be more efficient and we can use green energy. But if we keep on growing, we will produce more and more of these pans. So we will, at the end up with more inputs and more destroying the environment. And this obligation to grow and the destruction of the environment is not even true for things that people produce, that we, the humans, produce. It's even true for nature. At least if the nature is important and economically important for humans. As Herman Daly once pointed out, anything in nature that does not reproduce itself at the rhythm of interest is in danger of extinction. And here I give over to Josh, who will keep on talking, expanding on this idea. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Felix. So yeah, I wanted to touch on, excuse me, on one related topic stemming from that last point that Felix made, which is how the rate of interest creates incentives to engage in short-term oriented unsustainable practices, whereas a reduction or elimination of interest resulting from a Gesellian monetary reform would incentivize more sustainable long-term thinking. Something I haven't previously mentioned about myself is that I'm a professional musician and a musical instruments dealer. Having bought and sold a lot of vintage guitars, I'm very familiar with the history of unsustainable harvesting of Brazilian rosewood. Brazilian rosewood is the most prized type of wood for building the backs and sides of guitars. Unfortunately, during the first several decades of the 20th century, the wood was over-harvested until there was almost none left. It's now a protected species, and there are strict regulations in place protecting the few remaining trees. So today, if you want to build a guitar with Brazilian rosewood, you need to find some wood that was harvested decades ago. The wood has become so scarce that guitar builders now typically charge a couple $1,000s extra from their standard prices in order to build a guitar with Brazilian rosewood. And similarly, vintage instruments made with Brazilian rosewood from before the regulations went into effect fetch extreme prices. For example, 1969 was the last year that the Martin Guitar Company made their standard dreadnought models with Brazilian rosewood. After that, they switched to Indian rosewood. A model D28 guitar from 1969 with Brazilian rosewood is currently worth around $6,000, while a 1970 version of the exact same model, but with Indian rosewood, is worth around $3,000. So let's think about how the rate of interest is related to incentives facing owners of endangered resources like rosewood. Let's say you're the owner of a forestry company in Brazil that owns land with rosewood. And let's say your company has some debt on which you pay a 7% interest rate. How would that affect your incentives in terms of when to harvest trees? Trees grow faster when they're young and slower as they mature. Let's say a 5-year-old tree grows at 15%, a 12-year-old tree grows at 6%, and a 20-year-old tree grows at 3%. If you're looking to maximize profits, when will you choose to cut down that tree? By year 12, the growth rate of the tree falls below your cost of capital. Therefore, from a financial standpoint, the trees are no longer a good investment. So you'll cut down your 12-year-old trees. But now imagine that the artificial limit to the creation of capital caused by the rate of interest is reduced. Let's say the rate of interest falls to 3%. Now, allowing the tree to keep growing even at a slower annual growth rate becomes a good financial decision. With a 3% interest rate, your incentive will be to harvest the tree after year 20. And what would happen if the interest rate fell to 0? With an interest rate of 0, it would make sense to keep the tree alive until it stops growing. You're still going to harvest the wood at some point, but that time might be in 100 years instead of in 12. I also want to say very briefly that this example illustrates why my personal belief is that the time preference theory of interest actually has causality exactly backwards. As I said in a previous class, I don't think it's human nature on balance to prefer present consumption to future consumption, thereby necessitating a reward to be offered in order to get people to postpone consumption. Rather, I believe it's more accurate to say that we have lived our whole lives under conditions of positive interest, and therefore our preferences have been shaped by that fact. When you live and work and spend and save in a world where it's an economically bad decision not to cut down a young tree, your priorities inevitably come to reflect that incentive structure. So while it's true that many individuals and companies behave as if they had positive time preferences, I view that as an effect rather than a cause of the distorted economic environment we live in. All right, in the next class, we'll finally get to Silvio Gesell's proposal for a new form of money and discuss how it would alleviate or eliminate all of the problems we discussed today with our existing form of money.